just going to add, it may be optimistic to think that on the first day we actually get around to reading the Bible. Let's start with the authorship, where we always start. Who wrote this book? May seem obvious, James. Reasons that not really James. When for years I wondered why. If you talk about something that's based on Paul, it's Pauline. If it's Peter, it's Petrine. If it's James, it's Jacobin. In Hebrew, Jacob, which is Jacob. I don't know why we translate as James. I was not able to find that history in any source I would call reliable. I'm sure it exists. I just need to find it. But anyway, I'm sure it exists. I just need to find it. But anyway, Jacob is a very common Old Testament name as well, and a fairly important one of the patriarchs. So not at all surprising that brother. You get here James named after Jacob. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Peter. This is the first thing is our authorship. We're going to talk about when it was written as we get started as well. How many of you are using study Bibles? So you kind of had like an introduction. You were looking at some of that. The really interesting thing about James is that you're a commentator, as a for instance, I want to teach on. And these different sources variously describe the book as being divided into 5 sections, 12 sections, and 9 sections. At all what they're seeing. The background of the book, weird squishy symbolism for a little while. We need some. There are 2 James. If you've done any reading in your introductory stuff, what do your introductions say? Who do they write?
Half brother of Jesus.
Yeah, that's the consensus. There's a small minority who would say, who's the half brother of Jesus? And who else? Yes, John's brother. Exactly. Why is it highly unlikely that it's John's brother? Yeah, he's martyred in the book of Acts. Yeah, which means pretty early on. He's killed pretty early on. James, the half brother of Jesus, is also murdered. Okay. So that's the more likely of the 2. This James is also called James the Just. So if you see that kind of language, and this has to do with the way he led the Jerusalem church, and that's what he did. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church. Peter goes journeying as well, being James. So James is the bishop. Don't let that language throw you off if you're in a church that doesn't use bishops or doesn't have that official title for their things for office in the church. His job was to oversee the churches that met in Jerusalem. And I say churches. So you'll see this language back and forth. Church, churches, church, churches. It's not super closely defined. Later church history, they start defining the word church more closely. When you get the a lot of words in Psalms where it says, I will praise your name before the assembly, that refers to the church. Okay? They translate it as the word. Is that first big sermon on the book of Acts. They're not all meeting in one house. This especially because life, remember constantly because the situation you're in is changing. Churches that are meeting these individual assemblies, that these people are preaching and teaching the same things. Okay? Especially, at least on the most important issues. There's lots of variation on the less important issues, but on the most important issues, you want them preaching and teaching the same things. In the Eastern Church, I'm not sure if this is true in the Polish Catholic Church, but in most of the Eastern churches, meaning like Eastern European, literally guy in charge of all the churches in the city. Okay? So each, even though functionally in this day and age, they typically are in charge of much. Metropolitan of Pittsburgh covers most of what this continues to remain the title, and it points us back to the history of this stuff, that he became an overseer in the early church. When Peter gets on the road, someone else is left in charge, and it is James. He's called James the Just because of how well he sees in his 20 years as bishop. He serves for about 20 years, roughly, as bishop. Famine, poverty, person in the first 20 years. And he holds it all together beautifully. He's called the pillar of the church together for them. Because he's so this is who most authors will say wrote this. Now we're going to start with because in the words of scholar I like, Stephen DeYoung, where he says, because I haven't seen it, you'll eventually encounter it, is this idea that James wasn't written by James at all. Okay, here's the reason why. That they're calling it what's called a pseudepigraphal book. Again, Pastor Brett goes with your fancy words. So. Pseudepigraphal literally means written by somebody else claiming to be James. Okay, or to put it more charitably, someone who I'm writing this and I want him to be given the credit for this. Okay, because that wouldn't be uncommon either in the New Testament world. People regularly wrote in that way. They were giving credit and honor to their honored teacher. Okay, some more, say, progressive, liberal, adventurous scholars would say the same thing about Colossians and Ephesians. Okay, Paul was a guy named Erasmus. And in the Reformation debates, he stayed on the Catholic side. So that was considered the conservative side. I just want you to be familiar that this theory is floating out there, and there's one really big reason why they will say this is the case, and that's going to be chapter 30 with Paul's preaching about it, because it's causing unrest and problems within the church. So some people would say, and when I say late, so around the time that can I erase this stuff? For the book, where somewhere between, it's like 45. It has to be not much later than, like, that latest possible dating to have James the Just be the author is late 50 years, and Jesus was raised roughly 33 AD. Anyone else became familiar with Paul's writings on justification? It was causing chaos. How do we know it caused chaos? You're seeing, so Paul's teaching on justification is what? We're saved by grace through faith, not by works, that none may boast. Whether Paul wrote Ephesians, it's still the best summary of what Paul teaches. If James is familiar with it, Paul doesn't write those words till later. He is early as 50, but somewhere in that range later. But there are a couple pieces that, first and most important, the early that followed after them, who would have been trained by writers of the New Testament, they all accepted this as written by James, the Just, in Jerusalem. They would be in a position to know its history better than we are, right? Second, one other piece of why some people say it's later dating. It's really good Greek. It's literary style Greek, like the Gospel of Luke. Some people will say it doesn't sound like someone who's speaking Greek as a second language, which you would expect of James the Just or James the Brother. An early date is, of course, that they accepted the apostolic authorship. In terms of this Greek-speaking language, it's not at all clear anymore. Everybody speaks Greek everywhere he goes. And he's a few hundred years before this. They've discovered that the Jerusalem of Jesus' day which means that not only Jesus, but to go to Greece to do this. They didn't have to go to Rome to do this. Throughout Jerusalem. Essentially, we were watching a movie called, was it The Lost King? Yeah. Richard III was always accused of being a youth found. She actually, her big thing was to and an invalid king. But was studying, or Shakespeare was writing during Tudor rule, so he wasn't going to go against it. So if you read Richard III, he's portrayed as the madman, crazy usurper king. She had this conviction that was all propaganda, and she pretty well proved it. Proved it buried him with honor. They buried him like as a, and they don't put that on the use. Jerusalem was kind of backwater and stuff. Where those backwater idiots are with more literary Greek. Everyone who has to take teacher told him, as he said, well, Mark writes in about 8th grade Greek. In general, out in the world. That's the way Mark writes of his dealing with justification. That carries as much water as some people do. First of all, there's a reference to the synagogue as the place of meeting for the Christians. Now, this are Jewish Christians. Everybody agrees on this. It's often hyphenated. Jewish Christians. Okay? Everyone agrees that that's who the intended audience is. If the synagogue is mentioned as the meeting place, what does that tell us about the dating of it? Is that it's before 70 AD. Because once the temple is destroyed, the Jews who don't believe Jesus is the author, or Jesus, up till then they're kind of coexisting. But after the temple gets knocked down, they very reasonably say, why did God let this happen? And the conclusion they came to, meeting separately from non-Christian Jews. Okay? Before 70 AD, Jewish Christians would go to synagogue the Lord's Day. Okay? So, okay. Debates over the Torah. The 40s onward, and they're not like, let me settle this debate that's going on amongst you. And since this is a letter to an overseer, to other pastors, it would make sense to say, let me tell you what to teach. I mean, that's his job, is to say to them, here's what you have to preach and teach. And he doesn't approach it that way. He does talk about the way you can misunderstand justification, but he doesn't say, some people are saying this, I tell you this. So he doesn't seem to be where the debates have really gotten fierce yet. Because the reason we have all of almost immediately, all of Paul's reflections on the role of the law in justification are him writing letters to churches he founded going, no, it's not what we have. Early pastors in the church, Paul, they're writing about, it's really easy to get this wrong. If we're saved by grace through, I'm doing anything I want. I really like knowing I'm saved, and I hear that at church or in the Messiah's assembly. That's the problem they run into, that if you have faith, you don't have to live like a Christian. Apart from not interpret the language sexual immorality, look at the things that are being taught by numerous churches today. We just don't think that's immoral anymore. So we're still following the Bible. Okay, if we've come to faith. What's the relationship between? It's still the relationship between faith and works. And you're going to, when we get to James chapter 2, you're going to where he deals with justification is chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. It fits nicely into the early time period because it implies he's heard Paul's slogan of justification by faith, and senses its potential for division. He's heard the slogan. Why would he have heard the slogan? Well, we see it in Acts because Paul's teaching, and the apostles go, yeah, you got it right. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. You go to the Gentiles and we'll stay here and minister to the Jews. So Paul actually talks about this in his own words. He says, teaching something false, talking about that stuff. What James does with it, a little spoiler ahead of time, is he's going to nuance works as an expression of faith rather than a thing apart from it. So you don't think of faith and works as two separate things. Faith gives birth to works. Okay, they're not separate things, they're two sides of the same coin. He's also going to use the language of justification differently than Paul does. And this is a problem that continues to persist in the churches. We probably saw this occasionally in our Revelation study. Christians are notorious for using the same words differently with each other. That church uses Lutheran church, okay, or in a Catholic church, or in a Baptist church. We're using the same word. We're referencing the same thing in Scripture. We are more an authority in a Baptist church than they do in a Lutheran. He's thinking about the final judgment, the stuff we just saw at the end of standing before God right now. So you kind of make a mistake, even paralleling the two. So this is just going to be typical. Early on, again, maybe using different vocabulary because it hasn't become standardized. There's no seminaries you go to study with. The church is exploding in one generation. It goes from Jerusalem to quite possibly, and as far west as movement, to do quality text as we go, to talk to, or whatever, what were they trying to get at? How are they trying to help their people understand? It's what makes translation and what makes theology both art and science, and why we're still at it 2,000 years later, because it's just complicated. All right, which places us in the mid 40s. Pretty good thing. I mentioned First Thessalonians is Paul's earliest letter. First Thessalonians is written somewhere around 49. If you go with early authorship, if you go with late authorship, and the pseudepigraphal is written around the same time, somewhere between when Luke is written and when John is. It's written a lot like an Old Testament. So let's talk more about the intended audience. I mentioned that they're Jewish Christians. What kind of Jewish Christians are they? Anybody want to read the first line?
Christ to the 12 tribes in the dispersion.
In the dispersion. So there's a more common term we use than dispersion. I don't know why they chose to translate it in quite. That's what it means. So your translation went with translating the meaning rather than the word. But you started to say the word?
Diaspora.
Diaspora, yeah. Jewish diaspora regarding other groups, right? My wife studies has studied in the past at least the Celtic nations in the diaspora. So if you've listened to American folk music, a lot of that is what Irish and Scottish Gaelic stuff that means. So the Jewish Christians in the diaspora are who he's addressing. These are the Jews who are driven out of Jerusalem and who probably look to him as persecutions. So they're scattered all out to the nations, which is a way of saying Gentiles. They're not living in the Holy Land with the other Jews. They're living amongst their identity, amongst people who don't share their identity. Literature from the Babylonian exile. So that's going to be one of the types of literature it starts to look like, because he's dealing with a similar situation. The Babylonian in the diaspora. You're living amongst these pagans. How do you stay? We would say Christian, but they just think of themselves as fulfilled Jews, right? Scholars say we really need to think of Christianity as, because there were lots of versions of Second Temple Judaism. It's just Christianity was one of them, and it got huge. Okay, so this is probably is talking directly about Acts 19, excuse me, not 9, 19. There we go. Huh?
12 apostles.
Here, where those apostles went exactly. Of course, we have the oral history completely reliable because we stole documentary evidence. We're citing theories about that everybody tribes in Israel. I mean, Jesus is ministering in where? The northern kingdom is crushed. Jesus is born. There haven't been of the northern kingdom. So why use the language of 12 tribes here? There's probably at least two reasons. One, contra the Messianic rabbi who was here on Sunday teaching at our church, they saw themselves ethnic Israel. The 12 tribes. So you're addressing 12 tribes, but it's almost like symbolism. Like you represent Israel as it's supposed to be. We are the Israel of the end times, and your references there are going to be Isaiah 49:6 and Ezekiel 47:13. Isaiah 49 is a thing of Jerusalem in the end times, or of the world, the kingdom of God, and everybody's included. The 12 tribes are being destroyed. Isaiah's ministry begins with ministry to both the northern and southern kingdoms and ends with only the southern kingdom because the northern kingdom is destroyed. Ezekiel 47:13 is, of course, during the Babylonian exile, so that's after the southern kingdom's been destroyed. So prophesying the return of all southern kingdoms gone, God will bring everyone back. A way of saying, you know that we represent the hope of what God's going to do. Wherever you are, in whatever situation you're finding yourself amongst all those Gentiles, amongst this, and again, this points to of Gentiles for everyone outside. So they start using that. That's just historical reality. To refute replacement theology, you have. So people probably knew but that he's addressing all these, referring to them as the 12 tribes, because it's 12 kind of thing, referring to them as to do that. Okay, so mentioned there's lots of different ways to think about the structure of it. Like I said, my 9, 12, 5, it's actually written a great deal. I mentioned Proverbs is you're switching topics, find literary techniques to change topics. And a complete another thing related, it's the book of Romans, which those of us who've been through chapter 9, and then he has kind of an application from chapters 9 through 12. He takes 8 chapters building a very careful rabbinical case for what he's trying, which is one of the reasons it looks like wisdom literally was. Paul went from place to place founding churches, but he didn't pastor one group of people for any length of time. He get them started, and he goes to the next town preaching. He's an evangelist, essentially. He's in this one, he was much less. He's seeing them from birth through death. He's seeing people through all the cycles of being of life as being a Christian. He's more concerned with literature out of the exile, right? How do you live like a Christian in a foreign land? Or how do you live as a fulfilled Jew in a foreign land? Okay, so he's advising. Chapter 1, subjects 8 are there in book. The word perfect. It makes us nervous when Jesus says it anyway, right? Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Oh dear. Being translated, here is, I'm going to make sure I spell it, at least in transliteration correctly. This does mean perfect, but it carries a different kind of freight than we who grew up think of it. There's a guy named Anselm, Orthodox Church breaks from the Catholic Church. He writes a really, really significant book about why the atonement happened. It's basically a version of atonement theory, and it's that God's to grotesquely simplify what he's saying for us. He's kind of riffing. Most Protestants have some version of it, and it's very dominant in Catholicism as well. It's there in Orthodoxy too. Don't let them fool you. There's a lot of Orthodox are like, yeah, that's there in our liturgy. Atonement is it's not true. We do. This is death, life, death, resurrection, ascension. How did all that atone for our sins? How does that bring us back to God? There are more than just. It's kind of let them all hang out there, and us trying to fit. It's one that's always had some, particularly after the debates of the Reformation period, influenced by Greek thought. Because of the wars between the Muslims and Aristotle becomes important for a guy named Thomas Aquinas, but the Greek idea of perfect, once it's perfect, you don't touch it, you stand back. Because God can't, if God's perfect, God can't change. And movement implies change. So you have to move. The Jewish concept of perfection has nothing like that. What do we see God doing from the very first pages of Scripture? He's changing. He's mind about these things. He's an idea, because Jews don't hate physical reality. Greeks really have a problem with physical reality. Matter is a problem. Spirit is good. Spirit doesn't change. Matter does. It's an organic idea, and it means fullness. Or to keep it real, those who heard my sermon in July, pretty as they are, be perfect, be perfect, be perfect. It's be complete. Grow. Don't stop. Don't stop becoming what you were made and saved to become. Okay.
It's like the sanctification process. Is it along the same lines, or is there
It is. I asked my good friend who passed away 3 summers ago, Father John Reeves, and I used to have lots of talks about this stuff back and forth. And he said, the major difference between, even if your pastor's never, we think of justification and sanctification as completion at the final judgment. And so due to the debates that happened differently, just the Western Church focused more on Paul's vision, and the Eastern Church focused more on James's vision. Paul moves up from Turkey over, is what we want to, of being perfect without losing in the Gospels when Jesus says, "Be fruitful, be ye creative." And it sounds more like he saved me to grow, to become. So it's just, what are we? We're kind of, no. Our sensei he keeps ragging on the guy. My son and I are going to train with a guy named Hayama when we're over in Japan in a couple of months. Hayama is the line, you're growing more and more full, and be more like an oak. The oak keeps growing fuller and fuller and more beautiful. Every metaphor is somewhat limited. Oh, that's somebody's in the sanctuary playing with the speaker. And it's this concept of completion and fullness. All right? All right. We'll finish our introduction next week.